July 18th, 1984, Bensonhurst, Brooklyn. In a quiet basement apartment, the life of Angelo Sepe ended in sudden violence. Police found his body lying on the floor with multiple gunshot wounds to the head. Beside him was 19-year-old Joanne Lombardo, killed execution-style with a single shot to the mouth. A loaded gun sat untouched nearby, as if frozen in the moment it was never used. Drug paraphernalia was scattered across the room, staged to suggest a routine drug-related killing. There were no witnesses, no immediate suspects, and no arrests, just another double homicide in Brooklyn's long and growing list of unsolved cases. But this was not an ordinary murder. It was the final chapter in the life of a man deeply entangled in one of the most infamous criminal operations in American history, and it marked the end of a story that had been building for more than a decade. To understand why Angelo Sepe died the way he did, you have to understand the world that created him. Born in 1941 in Ozone Park, Queens, Sepe grew up in a working-class neighborhood where crime and survival often overlapped. Italian, Irish, and Jewish families lived side by side in tightly packed streets where everyone knew each other's business and where informal economies often ran parallel to legal ones. From an early age, Sepe was shaped by this environment. By the age of 14, he had already been arrested. As he grew older, his criminal record expanded steadily: burglary, robbery, assault, petty theft. Before he reached his 30s, he had accumulated 14 arrests. He was not unusual in his surroundings, but he was consistent, and in that world, consistency mattered more than morality. Physically, Sepe was unremarkable. Thin, quiet, and easy to overlook, he was the kind of man who rarely stood out in a room or in a lineup. That invisibility became an asset in the criminal world he entered. Men like him could move without drawing attention, carry out tasks without being remembered, and disappear into the background when things went wrong. But beneath that anonymity was a contradiction that made him more complex than many of his peers. Despite his history of violence and crime, Sepe had a known affection for animals. Stray cats, injured birds, abandoned creatures, all found their way into his care. Neighbors would later recall seeing him carefully tending to wounded animals, wrapping broken wings with improvised materials, feeding strays that others ignored. It was a quiet duality, a man capable of extreme violence who also showed unexpected patience and care in moments of vulnerability. By the early 1970s, Sepe found his way into the orbit of Jimmy Burke, a powerful and highly organized hijacker working under the umbrella of the Lucchese crime family. Burke, known as Jimmy the Gent, operated differently from traditional mafia figures. He did not rely on formal titles or visible authority. Instead, he built control through manipulation, bribery, and psychological dominance. Truck drivers were bribed with their own stolen wallets, often returned with a small amount of cash inside, creating a mix of fear and gratitude that ensured silence. Burke understood that power was not just about violence, it was about control over perception, loyalty, and fear. Within Burke's crew, Angelo Sepe became one of the trusted enforcers. Alongside him was Tommy DeSimone, known as Two-Gun Tommy, a man as polished in appearance as he was unpredictable in violence. Together, they formed part of a tightly controlled group of associates responsible for hijackings, robberies, and murders that were too risky for formal mafia members. These men were not made, meaning they were not officially inducted into the mafia hierarchy. They were expendable tools, useful, profitable, and always replaceable. In exchange for their work, they received money, protection, and a sense of belonging that was always conditional. As the years passed, Sepe became increasingly embedded in Burke's operations. He was reliable, disciplined, and willing to carry out orders without hesitation. That reliability mattered more than reputation. In this world, survival depended not on morality or loyalty in the emotional sense, but on utility. As long as someone was useful, they remained alive. Once they became a liability, they became disposable. The opportunity that would define Sepe's life came in the late 1970s through a fragile internal weakness within Kennedy Airport's cargo operations. A Lufthansa cargo supervisor named Louis Werner was drowning in gambling debt and financial desperation. His position gave him access to secure cargo shipments, particularly foreign currency transported from international banks. These shipments were valuable, untraceable, and poorly protected compared to their worth. Werner saw an opportunity to solve his financial collapse by betraying the system he worked in. In exchange for a cut of the proceeds, he provided detailed inside information, security procedures, employee schedules, alarm systems, and vault access points. What he delivered was not just intelligence, but a complete operational blueprint. On December 11th, 1978, that blueprint was put into motion. In the early hours before dawn, a black van carrying members of Burke's crew arrived at the Lufthansa cargo terminal. Angelo Sepe was inside. The operation began with precision. Security was bypassed, entry points were controlled, and employees were quickly subdued. Threats were made not just against those present, but against their families, ensuring compliance through fear rather than resistance. The psychological control was as important as the physical force. The goal was not chaos, it was silence and efficiency. Inside the terminal, employees were gathered and restrained. The alarm systems were disabled under coercion, and access to the vault was secured. The crew moved quickly, aware that time was their greatest risk. Inside the vault were dozens of cartons containing cash and valuables, foreign currency shipments valued at millions. The total haul was approximately $6 million, making it the largest cash robbery in American history at that time. The entire operation lasted roughly 30 minutes. No shots were fired, no alarms were triggered. On the surface, it was a perfect crime. But perfection in organized crime is always temporary. The weakness was not in execution, but in exposure. A critical mistake occurred when a getaway van was not properly destroyed and was later discovered by law enforcement. Inside it were fingerprints and trace evidence. That single failure began the unraveling of the entire operation. Panic spread quickly through the crew, not because of the police alone, but because of what the police represented: exposure, and exposure meant death in their world. Jimmy Burke responded with calculation rather than emotion. The problem was no longer how to profit from the robbery, but how to survive it. Too many people knew what had happened. Too many people could talk. In his logic, money was secondary to silence. The decision was made to eliminate anyone who posed a risk. What followed was not random violence, but systematic cleanup. Angelo Sepe became both participant and enforcer in this phase. Individuals connected to the robbery began disappearing or turning up dead under controlled circumstances. Parnell Stacks, Edwards, was among the first, executed in his apartment. Martin Krugman, a bookmaker who had helped connect parts of the operation, was later believed to have been murdered and dismembered. Louis Cafara and his wife disappeared after attracting attention through sudden spending. Others followed in rapid succession. Some were found in vehicles, others in apartments. Others simply vanished without explanation. Each death reduced the number of people who could potentially cooperate with law enforcement. By mid-1979, the aftermath of the Lufthansa heist had become a sustained internal purge. At least 9 individuals connected to the operation were dead or missing. The message was consistent and absolute. Survival required silence, and silence was enforced permanently. In this environment, fear replaced loyalty entirely. Even trust became a liability. Despite the collapse around him, Sepe survived. His survival was not accidental. Unlike others, he did not attract attention. He did not flaunt wealth or behave recklessly. He remained operationally useful and strategically invisible. In organized crime, these traits mattered more than loyalty or relationships. However, survival in this system was never stable. It was always conditional and temporary. Even close relationships could not override the rules. Tommy DeSimone, Sepe's closest associate, eventually became a liability himself. He was called to what he believed was an induction into the Mafia hierarchy, a moment he had long expected. Instead, he was executed for previous unauthorized killings of Gambino associates. His body was never recovered. His death reinforced a central truth of the organization. Even proximity to power did not guarantee protection from it. As the years passed, Jimmy Burke himself was eventually arrested for unrelated crimes, including point shaving in college basketball. He was later convicted of murder in a separate case and died in prison in 1996. The Lufthansa money was never recovered, and the full scope of the operation became increasingly fragmented as participants were killed or imprisoned. By the early 1980s, Angelo Sepe had returned to a lower-level criminal existence. He lived in a basement apartment in Brooklyn, disconnected from the scale of the Lufthansa operation, but still embedded within its shadow. His life had narrowed into survival, routine, and constant awareness of risk.
There was no legitimate path forward, no exit strategy, and no real future outside the system he had spent his life inside. According to multiple accounts, Sepe understood this clearly. He reportedly believed that his own organization would eventually kill him. This was not paranoia, it was structural awareness. In organized crime, people are not retired. They are removed when they become unnecessary or dangerous. That final outcome arrived in 1984. Sepe allegedly robbed a drug dealer who was operating under Mafia protection. In the logic of organized crime, this was not a simple theft. It was a violation of the protection economy itself, a system that depended on enforced trust. If protected individuals could be robbed without consequence, the entire structure would collapse. Protection would lose meaning. Payments would stop. Authority would weaken. The response had to be absolute. A decision was made within the Lucchese network. Sepe was no longer protected. His usefulness had ended, and his actions had created a structural threat. The enforcement mechanism activated, and the sentence was final. On the morning of July 18, 1984, the execution took place inside his basement apartment. The killers acted quickly and efficiently. Sepe was shot multiple times in the head, and Joanne Lombardo was killed as well. The scene was staged to resemble a drug-related dispute, a common tactic used to obscure organized crime killings. Within hours, the case was already becoming another unsolved file. In the aftermath, Angelo Sepe became another erased figure in the long history of the Lufthansa heist. A participant in the robbery, a survivor of the cleanup, and ultimately a victim of the same system he served. The case itself remains one of the most infamous crimes in American history, heavily documented, frequently retold, and often dramatized. But beneath the mythology lies a harsher reality, a system built on conditional loyalty, enforced silence, and inevitable elimination. Sepe's life reflects that reality without distortion. He survived the robbery, survived the purge, and survived the paranoia that followed. But he never escaped the structure itself. Because in organized crime, survival is never permanent. It is only delayed. And eventually, delay runs out. If you want more deep dives into hidden worlds like this, subscribe now and don't miss the next story.